Lieutenant Commander John Duncan Bulkley peered through his binoculars into the moonless Philippine night, watching the distant glow of enemy searchlights sweep across Manila Bay. It was March 12, 1942, and the Japanese had been tightening their stranglehold on the Philippines for months. What they didn't know was that America's newest weapon was about to make its deadly debut. Sleek, fast patrol torpedo boats that could strike like phantoms and vanish before the enemy could respond. The concept of these revolutionary vessels had emerged from the desperate need for speed and stealth in the Pacific theater. While massive battleships dominated headlines, these 78-foot plywood demons were designed to dart through enemy waters under cover of darkness, delivering devastating torpedo strikes before melting back into the shadows. Their crews called them PT boats, patrol torpedo boats. But the Japanese would soon have other names for these mysterious raiders that seemed to appear from nowhere. Captain Bulkley's Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had arrived in the Philippines just months before Pearl Harbor, bringing with them 6 of these experimental craft. Each boat carried 4 21-inch torpedoes, depth charges, and an array of machine guns, all powered by 3 12-cylinder Packard engines that could push the lightweight hull to speeds exceeding 40 knots. The boats were so new that many Navy officers questioned their effectiveness against the Imperial Japanese Navy's steel Leviathans. That skepticism vanished on the night of January 19, 1942, when PT-32 and PT-34 encountered a Japanese cruiser near Binanga Bay. Operating in complete radio silence, the 2 boats crept within 800 yards of the unsuspecting warship before launching their torpedoes. The explosion that followed lit up the night sky, and Japanese sailors frantically searched the darkness for an enemy that had already disappeared into the maze of Philippine islands. Word of the attack spread through Japanese naval circles like wildfire. How had such a large vessel been struck without any warning? Their sonar operators reported no submarine contacts, and their lookouts had seen nothing approaching through the calm waters. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier forces, ordered increased patrols and demanded answers from his intelligence officers about these mysterious attacks. The Americans had stumbled upon a tactical revolution. Unlike traditional naval warfare, which relied on massive firepower and armor, PT boat operations emphasized speed, stealth, and surprise. Their shallow draft allowed them to navigate waters where larger vessels feared to venture, while their small size made them nearly invisible to enemy radar. Most importantly, their wooden construction meant they produced minimal magnetic signatures, making detection by magnetic sensors almost impossible. As reports of successful PT boat operations reached Washington, Navy planners began to realize they had discovered something extraordinary. These small boats were achieving results that would normally require entire destroyer squadrons, and they were doing it with crews of just 12 to 14 men. According to official Navy records from the National Archives, PT boats in the early months of 1942 were averaging 1 successful torpedo hit for every 3 fired, an unprecedented accuracy rate that stunned naval strategists on both sides of the Pacific. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was immediate and profound. Sailors aboard cargo ships and escorts began reporting phantom attackers that struck without warning and vanished before counterattacks could be organized. The very uncertainty of when and where these ghost ships might appear began to affect Japanese operational planning, forcing them to divert precious resources to patrol duties and convoy protection. But the real test of America's secret weapon was yet to come. As Japanese forces pressed their advance across the Pacific, PT boats would face increasingly sophisticated opposition from an enemy determined to solve the mystery of these deadly phantoms once and for all. The steamy night air hung thick over Iron Bottom Sound as Lieutenant Commander Alan Montgomery checked his watch. 2200 hours, August 7, 1942. Guadalcanal had become the focal point of the Pacific War, and the waters surrounding this jungle-covered island had earned their grim nickname from the dozens of ships that now rested on the ocean floor. Tonight, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 was about to write another chapter in the growing legend of America's Ghost Fleet. Intelligence reports indicated a major Japanese naval force was approaching through what the enemy called the slot, the stretch of water between the Solomon Islands that had become a superhighway for Tokyo express runs. These nighttime supply missions brought reinforcements and supplies to Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, while American ships sought refuge during daylight hours from devastating air attacks launched from Rabaul. Commander Montgomery's flotilla consisted of 6 PT boats, PT-48, PT-60, PT-109, PT-124, PT-126, and PT-169. Each boat carried a crew that had been training for months in the art of night combat, learning to read the subtle differences between American and Japanese ship silhouettes in moonlight, memorizing the sound signatures of enemy engines, and mastering the delicate timing required for successful torpedo attacks. The Japanese force approaching that night was formidable. 4 destroyers escorting a convoy of 8 cargo vessels loaded with troops and supplies. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, commanding the escort force, had developed sophisticated tactics for these high-speed runs, utilizing destroyers that could outrun most American surface vessels while delivering devastating firepower against any opposition they encountered. What Admiral Tanaka didn't anticipate was facing an enemy that refused to engage in traditional surface combat. At 23:30 hours, the first PT boat made contact with the Japanese formation approximately 12 miles northwest of Savo Island. Lieutenant John Kennedy, commanding PT-109, spotted the distinctive silhouettes of enemy destroyers against the starlit horizon and immediately radioed the sighting to his squadron mates. The attack that followed demonstrated the evolution of PT boat tactics since those early engagements in the Philippines. Rather than approaching individually, the boats coordinated their assault, with 2 boats creating a diversion while the others maneuvered for optimal torpedo firing positions. PT-48 and PT-60 approached from the port side of the Japanese formation, their engines muffled to reduce sound signatures, while the remaining boats circled to attack from starboard. At precisely midnight on December 12, 1942, the coordinated assault began. PT-48 launched 4 torpedoes at the lead destroyer, while PT-60 targeted the second vessel in line. The Japanese lookouts finally spotted the attacking boats just as the torpedoes struck home. The destroyer Teruzuki, hit by 2 torpedoes from PT-48, erupted in a massive explosion that illuminated the entire convoy for several crucial seconds. According to a detailed account preserved in the Naval War College archives, the Japanese response was swift but largely ineffective against such small, fast-moving targets. Destroyer searchlights swept frantically across the water, while 5-inch guns fired at muzzle flashes and suspected boat positions. However, the PT boats had already changed course and speed multiple times, making them nearly impossible to track in the darkness. The psychological impact of this engagement resonated far beyond the immediate tactical success. Japanese naval commanders began receiving reports from survivors describing attackers that appeared to materialize from the darkness itself. Sailors spoke of boats that seemed to anticipate Japanese maneuvers, striking at the exact moment when escorts were most vulnerable, then vanishing so completely that some began to question whether they had faced a new type of submarine. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, commanding the combined fleet, ordered a comprehensive analysis of these mysterious attackers. Japanese naval intelligence officers studied every available report, attempting to understand how such small vessels could achieve such devastating results against superior forces. Their conclusions would lead to significant changes in Japanese convoy tactics and the development of new countermeasures specifically designed to combat America's Phantom Fleet. The success at Guadalcanal marked a turning point in PT boat operations, transforming them from experimental vessels into a proven weapon system that would play an increasingly important role in America's Pacific strategy. Commander Robert Bowling Kelly stood on the cramped bridge of PT-103, studying the phosphorescent wake of his boat as it cut through the dark waters of Ferguson Passage. It was January 15, 1943, and American forces had been fighting for control of the Solomon Islands for nearly 6 months. The nightly cat-and-mouse game between PT boats and the Japanese Tokyo Express had evolved into a deadly ballet of thrust and counter-thrust, with each side adapting new tactics to counter their opponent's latest innovations. The Japanese had learned to fear the American ghost boats, but they had also learned to hunt them. Admiral Tanaka had developed new convoy formations that placed destroyers in defensive screens around supply vessels, while Japanese aircraft conducted intensive daylight patrols searching for PT boat bases. More ominously, Japanese naval intelligence had begun deploying specialized hunter-killer groups whose sole mission was to locate and destroy America's Phantom Fleet. Kelly's squadron had been operating from a hidden base on Tulagi, where maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the temperamental Packard engines running and the lightweight hulls patched after each engagement. The boats were showing wear from months of continuous operations in tropical waters, but their crews had developed an almost supernatural ability to locate enemy forces in the maze of islands and channels that characterized the Solomons campaign. Tonight's mission was particularly challenging. Intelligence reports indicated that a major Japanese supply convoy was approaching through Vela Gulf, escorted by at least 6 destroyers and supported by cruiser forces positioned to intercept any American surface ships that might attempt to interfere. The convoy carried critical supplies for Japanese forces on New Georgia, including ammunition, food, and reinforcements needed to maintain their defensive positions against the advancing American offensive. The PT boat force assigned to intercept this convoy represented the largest concentration of torpedo boats yet assembled for a single mission. 15 boats from 3 different squadrons would coordinate their attack, using tactics that had been refined through months of combat experience. The plan called for the boats to approach in 3 separate groups, attacking simultaneously from different directions to overwhelm the Japanese defensive screen. At 01:15 hours, the first group of PT boats made contact with the enemy convoy, approximately 8 miles south of Kolombangara Island. Lieutenant Commander Westholm, leading the attack, could see the silhouettes of at least 4 destroyers screening a formation of
precision. Despite the terror of knowing that death could come at any moment from the depth charges exploding around them, the Japanese destroyers continued their attack until early evening, dropping over 100 depth charges in their attempt to destroy the submarine that had sunk their carrier. However, as darkness approached and fuel ran low, they were forced to abandon the search and rejoin the main fleet. Captain Kudo's final message to fleet headquarters reported the probable destruction of the enemy submarine, but Kavala had successfully escaped to fight another day. As the sounds of the Japanese destroyers faded into the distance, Kavala's crew began to assess the damage from their ordeal. Remarkably, despite the intensity of the depth charge attack, the submarine had suffered only minor damage and remained fully operational. The escape had been harrowing, but successful, allowing them to complete their war patrol and return to base with news of their victory. The silence that followed the Japanese depth charge attack felt almost supernatural after hours of explosive violence, broken only by the steady hum of Kavala's electric motors and the occasional drip of seawater through damaged seals. Commander Kostler cautiously raised the periscope for the first time in 4 hours, scanning the empty ocean surface where moments before Japanese destroyers had prowled. Like angry sharks, the absence of enemy vessels confirmed what sonar had already indicated. They had survived the counterattack and successfully escaped from one of the most intense submarine hunts of the Pacific War. Throughout the submarine, crew members began the careful process of damage assessment and emergency repairs. The boat's chief engineer, Lieutenant William Patterson, reported that while several systems had sustained damage, none were critical to the submarine's survival or operational capability. Water had entered through loosened joints and damaged ventilation systems, requiring constant pumping to maintain proper trim. More seriously, the intense depth charging had damaged some of the submarine's sensitive sonar equipment, reducing their ability to detect enemy ships at long range. The psychological impact of the attack was perhaps more significant than the physical damage. Several crew members exhibited signs of combat stress, having endured their first major depth charge attack under actual combat conditions. The submarine's medical officer worked to treat both physical injuries and psychological trauma, understanding that maintaining crew morale was essential for future operations. Despite their fear, every man had performed his duties with the professionalism expected of submarine service personnel. Word of Shokaku's destruction spread quickly through allied intelligence networks, confirming what Cavala's crew already knew. They had achieved one of the most significant submarine victories of the war. The carrier's loss was particularly meaningful because of her role in the Pearl Harbor attack, making Cavala's success a form of poetic justice for the American Navy. Intelligence officers would later calculate that sinking Shokaku removed nearly one-third of Japan's remaining fleet carrier capacity from the war. The strategic implications of the carrier's destruction extended far beyond the loss of a single ship. Shokaku had been one of Japan's most experienced carriers, with a crew trained in the complex operations required for effective naval aviation. Her destruction eliminated not only the ship herself, but also hundreds of trained aviation personnel, who could not be easily replaced. The Japanese Navy's pilot training program had been severely compromised by losses earlier in the war, making every experienced aviator irreplaceable. As Cavala began her journey back to base, her crew reflected on the day's events and their place in the larger Pacific campaign. They had participated in one of the decisive naval battles of World War II, contributing to what historians would later recognize as the effective end of Japanese carrier-based aviation as a strategic force. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had cost Japan over 400 aircraft and many of her most experienced pilots, while Cavala's attack had eliminated one of the few remaining fleet carriers capable of conducting offensive operations. The submarine's radioman finally broke radio silence to transmit a coded message to Pacific Fleet Headquarters, reporting the successful attack on the enemy carrier. This transmission would trigger celebrations throughout the American fleet, as news of Shokaku's destruction spread among units that had suffered under her aircraft's attacks. For over 2 years, the psychological impact of the victory was as important as its strategic value, demonstrating that American submarines could strike successfully, even at heavily defended enemy fleet units. For the men of USS Cavala, the mission's success validated months of rigorous training and preparation, but also highlighted the deadly nature of submarine warfare in the Pacific. News of Shokaku's destruction reached Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters at Pearl Harbor within hours, sparking celebrations throughout the Pacific Fleet as officers realized the strategic significance of Cavala's successful attack. The sinking represented far more than the elimination of a single enemy vessel. It marked another crucial step in the systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation power that would ultimately determine the outcome of the Pacific War. Intelligence analysts immediately began calculating the long-term implications of losing such an experienced carrier, understanding that Japan's ability to conduct effective naval operations had been dealt another devastating blow. The timing of Shokaku's destruction proved particularly significant, coming during the largest carrier battle in naval history. Naval aviation and anti-aircraft fire shot down nearly 480 Japanese aircraft, 346 of those carrier aircraft on June 19th alone. Combined with Cavala's torpedo attack, the events of June 19th effectively eliminated Japanese carrier aviation as an offensive force capable of challenging American naval supremacy in the Pacific. The psychological impact on remaining Japanese naval personnel was profound, as they watched their most capable units systematically destroyed by superior American training and equipment aboard other Japanese vessels in the mobile fleet. News of Shokaku's loss created a crisis of confidence among officers who had believed their escorts could protect fleet carriers from submarine attack. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa faced the stark reality that his remaining carriers were equally vulnerable to undersea assault, despite operating with supposedly adequate destroyer screens. The loss forced a fundamental reassessment of Japanese naval tactics, leading to increasingly defensive operations that surrendered strategic initiative to American forces. For USS Cavala's crew, the journey home provided time to process the magnitude of their achievement while dealing with the psychological aftermath of combat. Many crew members had never experienced depth charge attacks before their encounter with Japanese destroyers, and several required ongoing medical attention for stress-related symptoms. The submarine's medical officer worked continuously to maintain crew morale, while treating both physical injuries and combat fatigue among men who had faced death repeatedly. During their war patrol, the strategic ramifications of Shokaku's destruction extended beyond immediate tactical considerations to affect Japanese industrial planning and resource allocation. The carrier's loss eliminated years of investment in naval aviation training and development, representing a sunk cost that Japan's war economy could not afford to repeat. More critically, the destruction removed one of the few remaining platforms capable of projecting Japanese naval power across the vast distances of the Pacific theater. American submarine commanders throughout the Pacific drew important lessons from Cavala's successful attack, particularly regarding the vulnerability of enemy carriers during flight operations. The tactical intelligence gathered during the engagement would influence submarine doctrine for the remainder of the war, emphasizing the importance of attacking enemy vessels when they were most vulnerable to torpedo damage. This knowledge would contribute to additional carrier sinkings as American submarines became increasingly aggressive in their operations against Japanese naval forces. The sinking also demonstrated the effectiveness of American submarine construction and crew training programs that had been developed during the early years of the war. Cavala's survival of the intense depth charge attack validated design improvements incorporated into Gato-class submarines, while her crew's performance under pressure reflected the high standards of the submarine services selection and training processes. These factors would prove crucial as American submarines continued their devastating campaign against Japanese shipping throughout the Pacific. As Cavala approached her home base, her crew prepared to share their experiences with intelligence officers eager to learn every detail of the successful attack, knowing that their information would contribute to future operations against the increasingly desperate Japanese fleet. The submarine base at Pearl Harbor erupted in celebration as USS Cavala surfaced in the early morning hours of July 4, 1944. Her crew, returning as conquering heroes after one of the most successful war patrols in submarine service history. The USS Cavala is best known as the Avenger of Pearl Harbor and earned the prestigious Presidential Unit Citation for sinking the Japanese aircraft carrier Shokaku, a vessel which attacked Pearl Harbor. Commander Costler and his crew were greeted by Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Pacific Fleet submarines, who personally congratulated each man for their role in eliminating one of Japan's most dangerous warships. The intelligence debriefing process began immediately, with naval intelligence officers recording every detail of the attack for analysis and dissemination to other submarine crews. The information gathered from Cavala's crew would influence submarine tactics throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, particularly regarding the vulnerability of enemy carriers during flight operations. Officers were particularly interested in the timing of the attack and the Japanese response, seeking to understand how future submarine operations could maximize their effectiveness against heavily defended enemy fleet units. Awards and recognition flowed freely for Cavala's crew, with Commander Costler receiving the Navy Cross for his exceptional leadership during the attack. The entire crew was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors available to military units, recognizing their collective achievement in destroying such a significant enemy target. Individual crew members received various medals and commendations based on their specific contributions to the mission's success. From the torpedo men who maintained the weapons to the sonar operators who tracked the target, media coverage of the sinking was carefully managed by naval censors, who understood the propaganda value of the victory, while recognizing the need to protect operational security. The story of Cavala's success was released to American newspapers and radio stations, providing much-needed good news to a home front that had endured years of war. The narrative of the Pearl Harbor attacker being sent to the bottom by an American submarine resonated powerfully with the American public, symbolizing the nation's growing dominance in the Pacific theater. The crew's shore leave provided well-deserved rest and recreation after months of dangerous patrol duty, but many found it difficult to readjust to normal activities after their intense combat experience. The submarine service's medical staff worked with crew members experiencing what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, providing counseling and support to help them process their experiences. The Navy's understanding of combat stress was limited compared to modern standards, but efforts were made to ensure that submarine crews remained effective for future operations. Training commands throughout the submarine service studied Cavala's attack in detail, incorporating lessons learned into instruction programs for new submarine crews. The successful engagement demonstrated the importance of patience, precision, and aggressive action when opportunities presented themselves. Future submarine commanders would benefit from understanding how Costler had positioned his boat for the attack and managed the subsequent depth charge evasion, techniques that would save lives and increase mission success rates. The psychological impact of Cavala's victory extended beyond the submarine service to influence broader American naval strategy in the Pacific. The successful attack demonstrated that Japanese fleet carriers, previously considered nearly invulnerable when properly escorted, could be destroyed by well-trained submarine crews operating modern boats. This knowledge encouraged more aggressive submarine operations against high-value enemy targets, contributing to the accelerated pace of Japanese naval losses during the final years of the war. As preparations began for Cavala's next war patrol, her crew understood that they had participated in one of the defining moments of the Pacific War, helping to turn the tide of battle in favor of American forces. The sinking of Shokaku by USS Cavala on June 19, 1944, marked a decisive turning point in the Pacific War that resonated far beyond the immediate tactical victory achieved by a single submarine crew. The attack eliminated one of Japan's last effective fleet carriers, while simultaneously demonstrating the vulnerability of even heavily defended enemy naval units. Two American submarine operations. Historical analysis would later reveal that this single engagement, combined with the air battles of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, effectively ended Japan's ability to conduct offensive carrier operations for the remainder of World War II. The events of June 19, 1944 destroyed the naval air power of Japan, while the attack by U.S. forces the following day focused on the ships of the IJN, almost completely eliminated Japan's remaining carrier force. The strategic implications of this destruction extended throughout the final year of the Pacific War, as Japanese naval forces were increasingly restricted to defensive operations that could not prevent American advances toward the Japanese home islands. The loss of experienced pilots and aviation personnel.
16 Marine SBD Dauntless dive bombers and 11 Army B-17 Flying Fortresses took off from the battered but still functional airfield, their crews knowing they faced a Japanese fleet protected by hundreds of fighters. As these heroic attacks developed, Vice Admiral Nagumo faced a crucial decision aboard his flagship Akagi. His strike commander, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, radioed that a second attack on Midway would be necessary to neutralize the island's defenses completely. But Nagumo had held back 93 aircraft armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, specifically to attack any American naval forces that might appear. The decision that followed would haunt Japanese naval officers for the rest of their lives. At 0715, Nagumo ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed with land bombs for a second strike against Midway. This process would take over an hour to complete, during which time the Japanese carriers would be extraordinarily vulnerable to attack. Unknown to Nagumo, American search planes had already spotted his fleet. At 0520, Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, flying from the carrier Yorktown, had radioed the message that would change history. "Scratch 1 flat top. Dixon to carrier. Scratch 1 flat top." But this was premature. Dixon had spotted Japanese cruisers, not the precious carriers that represented Japan's primary striking power. The real prize remained hidden beneath a layer of clouds and morning haze, protected by a screen of destroyers and cruisers that bristled with anti-aircraft guns. But time was running out for both sides as the greatest carrier battle in naval history approached its climactic phase. Aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, Commander Minoru Genda watched with growing anxiety as armorers struggled to rearm the strike aircraft crowded on the flight deck. It was 0830 on June 4, 1942, and what should have been a routine operation had become a nightmare of conflicting orders and mounting confusion. Vice Admiral Nagumo had just received the most unwelcome message possible from his reconnaissance aircraft. 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. The presence of American naval forces fundamentally changed the tactical situation and demanded an immediate response, but Nagumo's aircraft were in the worst possible configuration for such an emergency. The Japanese admiral faced a devil's bargain that would have challenged the most experienced naval commander. His first wave of aircraft was returning from Midway, low on fuel and requiring immediate recovery. His second wave was half-armed with land bombs instead of the armor-piercing weapons needed for naval targets. Meanwhile, American aircraft from Midway were already attacking his fleet, forcing defensive maneuvers that disrupted flight operations. "Change armament to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs," Nagumo ordered, countermanding his earlier instructions. "Prepare for immediate launch against enemy fleet units." But the damage was already done. Precious time had been lost, and the flight decks were now cluttered with ordnance handlers frantically switching weapons, while fuel lines snaked across the decks to service returning aircraft. As referenced in Mitsuo Fuchida's first-hand account, Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, the Japanese carriers had become floating powder kegs, their decks stacked with armed aircraft, fuel hoses, and loose ordnance that would prove catastrophically vulnerable to enemy attack. At 0920, the first wave of American torpedo bombers appeared on the horizon. 15 TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 8 launched from the carrier Hornet under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. These obsolete aircraft, flying without fighter escort, approached the Japanese fleet in a hopeless attack that would cost them everything but buy crucial time for the main American strike. "My God, they're sitting ducks," observed Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey from his SBD Dauntless dive bomber high above the battle. McCluskey commanded 37 dive bombers from the carrier Enterprise, and he had been circling for nearly an hour searching for the Japanese fleet. Below him, Waldron's torpedo bombers pressed their attack with suicidal courage, drawing every Japanese fighter down to sea level in a desperate defensive action. The slaughter was complete and terrible. Within minutes, all 15 Devastators had been shot down, with only Ensign George Gay surviving to witness the battle from his life raft. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. The Japanese fighters were now out of position and low on fuel, unable to defend against the high-altitude attack that was about to descend upon them. At 10:24, McCluskey spotted the Japanese carriers through a break in the clouds and immediately pushed over into his attack dive. 37 American dive bombers screamed down through the clear Pacific sky toward targets that could not have been more perfectly prepared for destruction. The Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were caught with their flight decks packed with fueled and armed aircraft, their crews desperately trying to launch a strike force that would never get airborne. Lieutenant Dick Best, leading the first section of dive bombers, selected the Akagi as his target and released his 1,000-pound bomb at 1,500 feet altitude. The weapon struck just behind the carrier's midships elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck before exploding among the armed and fueled aircraft waiting to launch. Secondary explosions followed immediately, as aviation gasoline ignited and torpedo warheads detonated in a chain reaction that doomed Japan's most prestigious aircraft carrier. Similar scenes of destruction played out aboard the Kaga and Soryu, as American bombs found their marks with devastating precision. Within the space of 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been transformed from mighty warships into blazing funeral pyres that would carry the dreams of Japanese empire to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The tide of war had turned in those brief, terrible minutes above the blue waters of Midway. The acrid smoke from 3 burning aircraft carriers stung Vice Admiral Nagumo's eyes as he stood on the bridge of the Akagi at 10:46 on June 4, 1942. Around him, the cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy fought desperately to save their flagship, but the carrier was doomed. Fuel fires raged out of control in the hangar spaces. Ammunition exploded in devastating secondary blasts, and the flight deck buckled under the intense heat of burning aviation gasoline. "Sir, we must transfer your flag," urged Captain Taijiro Aoki, the Akagi's commanding officer. "The ship cannot be saved." The words hung in the smoky air like a death sentence for Japanese hopes in the Pacific. This was the same carrier from which the Pearl Harbor attack had been launched just 6 months earlier, and now she was dying beneath the bombs of the very enemy she had sought to destroy. But Japan's agony was not yet complete. The carrier Hiryu, slightly separated from her sister ships, had escaped the devastating American attack and was preparing her own counterstrike. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding Carrier Division 2, was determined to salvage something from the disaster that had befallen the mobile force. "Launch immediately," Yamaguchi ordered his strike commander. "Target the American carriers before they can attack us again." 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters lifted off from the Hiryu's deck, carrying Japan's hopes for revenge against the force that had just delivered such a crushing blow to their fleet. The Japanese strike, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, found the American task force 2 hours later. Their target was the carrier Yorktown, still bearing scars from the Battle of the Coral Sea, but fighting with desperate efficiency under Captain Elliot Buckmaster. The Japanese attacked with the skill and courage that had made them masters of the Pacific, but they faced anti-aircraft fire of unprecedented intensity from American ships that had learned hard lessons about defending against air attack. 3 Japanese bombs struck the Yorktown in quick succession, penetrating her flight deck and starting fires in the interior of the ship. But American damage control techniques, refined through months of hard experience, proved superior to anything the Japanese had developed. Within 2 hours, the Yorktown was back in action, her flight deck operational and her aircraft launching for another strike against the remaining Japanese carrier. As referenced in Walter Lord's masterful Incredible Victory, the resilience demonstrated by American ships and crews during the Battle of Midway reflected both superior damage control training and the industrial capacity that allowed rapid repair of battle damage using standardized parts and equipment. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the Hiryu launched a second strike. 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters under Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same officer who had led the morning attack on Midway Island. These aircraft found the Yorktown again, and this time their torpedoes struck home with devastating effect. The carrier took on a severe list and lost power, forcing Captain Buckmaster to order abandon ship. But American vengeance was already in the air. 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, had located the Hiryu and were beginning their attack run, just as Tomonaga's aircraft were landing back aboard their ship. The Japanese carrier, caught in the same vulnerable condition that had doomed her sisters, could not avoid the fate that awaited her. 4 direct hits from American dive bombers transformed the Hiryu into another blazing wreck within minutes. Admiral Yamaguchi, choosing death over the dishonor of defeat, remained aboard his flagship as she settled slowly toward the bottom of the Pacific. By nightfall on June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers lay destroyed or sinking, their aircraft and crews scattered across hundreds of square miles of ocean. The once mighty mobile force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months had been utterly destroyed in a single day. Japan's offensive capability in the Central Pacific was broken, and the initiative in the war had passed permanently to the United States. The setting sun that evening illuminated the funeral pyres of Japanese naval aviation, marking the beginning of the end for the empire that had dreamed of dominating the Pacific Ocean. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in the communications center of the battleship Yamato, as devastating reports flooded in from the disaster unfolding 300 miles to the east. It was evening on June 4th, 1942, and the architect of Pearl Harbor was witnessing the destruction of everything he had worked to build. 4 fleet carriers destroyed, hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew dead, and Japan's offensive momentum in the Pacific shattered beyond repair. "All carriers lost, sir," reported his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, his voice barely above a whisper. "Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu are either sunk or sinking. The mobile force has ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit." The magnitude of the disaster defied comprehension. In a single day, Japan had lost more naval aviation capacity than could be replaced in years of intensive production. Worse still, the veteran pilots and aircrew who had spearheaded Japan's expansion across the Pacific were gone forever. men whose experience and skill represented decades of training and combat knowledge that no amount of industrial effort could quickly restore. Yamamoto's mind raced through the strategic implications of what had occurred. The carefully planned timetable for Japanese expansion had assumed the destruction of American naval aviation at Midway, clearing the way for operations against Fiji, Samoa, and eventually the Hawaiian Islands themselves. Instead, the American Pacific Fleet remained intact and had demonstrated a level of tactical skill and fighting efficiency that boded ill for future Japanese operations. Captain Kuroshima, the fleet operations officer, proposed continuing the battle with the massive surface fleet still available. "Sir, we retain overwhelming superiority in battleships and cruisers. If we can bring the Americans to surface action, we can still achieve victory." But Yamamoto understood better than his subordinates that the age of the battleship had ended over the smoking wrecks of his aircraft carriers. Surface ships, no matter how powerful, could not operate effectively without air cover against an enemy that retained strong carrier forces. The fundamental nature of naval warfare had been revolutionized, and Japan had just learned this lesson in the most costly way possible. "Signal all units," Yamamoto ordered with characteristic decisiveness. "Operation MI is cancelled. All forces will withdraw to the west immediately." The admission of defeat came hard to officers trained in the samurai tradition that preferred death to dishonor, but Yamamoto's strategic vision remained clear despite the emotional devastation of the moment. The withdrawal of the Japanese fleet marked more than just the end of a failed operation. It represented the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. Never again would Japanese forces possess the strength and confidence to launch major offensive operations against heavily defended American positions. The strategic initiative had passed permanently to the United States, and with it went Japan's last hope of achieving a negotiated peace from a position of strength. As referenced in John Keegan's comprehensive analysis, The Second World War, the Battle of Midway represented the decisive turning point in the Pacific theater, marking the moment when Japan's expansion reached its furthest extent and began the inexorable contraction that would end 3 years later with surrender in Tokyo Bay. The human cost of this strategic reversal was measured not just in ships and aircraft, but in the lives of Japan's finest naval aviators. Men like Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shirane, who had led attacks at Pearl Harbor and across the Dutch East Indies, perished in the waters around Midway along with hundreds of their comrades. These losses could not be replaced quickly,